All right, so I am really excited to introduce to you tonight our two speakers. So first we have Trey Walk, who is an advocate and writer living in Brooklyn, New York. He has worked with organizations across the U.S. on community organizing, providing direct client services, and winning policy change, including the Groundwork Project, Equal Justice Initiative, and the Human Rights Watch. Trey provides freelance research training and consulting services for several nonprofits and digital publications. His portfolio of work shines light on forgotten histories and communities. And then we also have Penn Christian. Penn is the Director of Communications at Groundwork Project. They've worked with organizations focused on various issue areas, including reproductive justice and LGBTQ plus rights. Penn has an MA in Gender Studies and a BA in Gender and Activism and Cultural Anthropology. They live in Detroit, Michigan, with their partner and cat Turkey. Ooh, that's very cute. All right, I'm gonna spotlight. I'm gonna get a spotlight up here on our two speakers, and we'll turn it over to them.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Julie. And thanks everybody for taking the time out of your evening to be here with us and to talk about this important topic. We only have an hour together, which is not enough time to go into lots and lots of details about all of the potential risk and ways to mitigate them on the big wide internet. So what we're going to try to do today is to help think together about what are some of the risks that you're more likely to be exposed to online because of your activism, because you're stepping up in your community and having a bit more of a public profile. What are some of the ways you could start thinking about potential risk and scanning your environment? And then what are some just daily basic practices that you can put into place to make you safer in your organization and the people that you're organizing on behalf of? So I'm going to share my screen and have some slides, and I will hopefully not have any issues with this, and we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, I think we're up. Okay, this is us. You met us already. So a few goals. I could, no, that's not- oh, okay. I think I'm back. Froze for a second. To consider the potential threats in an online environment for community activists. We know a lot of you are starting to, or have been for a while, taking on leadership roles in your community. We want to talk about this concept of a risk appetite because what we're going to do today is not provide correct yes or no answers about what you should or shouldn't do. So much of it is going to depend on your organization, and what you all kind of prioritize in terms of digital safety. We'll talk through some basic principles and tools to start thinking about. And then at the end, we'll share a few resources for people who have maybe higher risk or people who want to dive deeper and learn more about other ways that they can keep themselves safe. So we'll be showing some of those resources and sending them out afterwards. So just to step back for a second, and why we offer this training and why we think it's important. Um, Many of you know there's a long history of people who are activists and organizers, especially for civil and human rights, have historically been subject to surveillance or punishment or backlash because of their activism. Oftentimes, they're pushing for things that aren't necessarily the majority position or popular or create change. And so that automatically puts us at risk. And then, of course, our digital age only amplifies those risks and creates additional things that we need to be thinking about in terms of bad actors who might be interested in preventing our work. There are certain issues that are more likely to face threats online. People of color, undocumented people, LGBTQ people, especially the trans community, people who are involved in harm reduction work, anyone who's doing reproductive justice work or people seeking abortion care, and then anyone who has a record with in the criminal legal system. These are some potential identity categories to be thinking about. An escalated risk profile for yourself. And then, of course, we find ourselves in this political moment where all of these things are escalating. Penn and I were kind of thinking about this because we've offered this training in previous years, but 2025 is, of course, a unique moment. We're seeing more and more of the use of generative AI. We're seeing these platforms become increasingly unstable and trying to figure out what the landscape is going to be in the longer term. And then a new presidential administration and changes in the political environment in terms of whether our data is safe or not. So I'm going to go into what we're going to do now is go into a few of the potential threats and just things to have in mind as you're planning your work. So this first slide shows an example of ways that law enforcement could be a potential source of surveillance. We know that there are many companies who share data and information with law enforcement offices. So whether that's the Ring camera, whether that's tracking people's phones, whether it's kind of direct investigators who are surveilling people. And sometimes that work can be for basic organizing issues like racial justice. And if you become someone who is considered a target or higher risk, you might be someone who is then subject to surveillance. And so you might want to be thinking more carefully about your kind of public profile and what you're saying online. Here are a few more examples. There were some counterterrorism tactics used at Standing Rock to defeat the pipeline. There have been concerns from experts about potential data hacking on period tracking apps or pregnancy apps in states that have banned abortion care. And then there are also risk to LGBTQ people in places where their communities are under attack, risk of potential surveillance depending on their online activity. And then here's a couple of more examples around immigration and customs enforcement in ways that they're able to collect vast amounts of data on the American public. And in this category, the one thing I'll say is that it might not be the case that law enforcement is necessarily the source that you're concerned about. For example, you might be someone who wants law enforcement to protect you because you feel like you're at higher risk. But you should think about what actions you're involved in that could be threatening to any entity. So not all law enforcement is the same. We're seeing this play out in Los Angeles right now. There could be one law enforcement group that is on your side and trying to protect the community, another group where you might be at risk. And so you want to be thinking about the kind of multiple places where you could be exposed. There's also the case that sometimes private security companies will have their own security forces, and that can also be another thing to keep your eye on. For example, this summer there were protests at lots of Tesla factories, and so sometimes in situations like that, there are additional risks that you should be thinking about. Another kind of common example is community members protesting the creation of construction sites where there might be additional pollution in a community. Those are places where you might have additional surveillance. So one concept that we want to kind of talk through is this idea of a risk appetite. And this is something that I think helps frame the rest of the presentation in terms of there are no right answers. You can kind of make different choices to be safer or unsafer, but it's ultimately going to be up to you what steps you take. And so what we're going to do is a little bit of an activity, and I'm just going to call out a few scenarios. And I want you to think about whether this scenario is something you would be in the green zone for. So this is something I'm going to be super excited to say yes to. I think it's a great idea or whether you'd be in the yellow zone. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, or in a red zone. So the first scenario is let's say one of your members in your organization or one of your community members wants to go on Facebook and live stream a protest in real time to the internet. Just think about that scenario where you would fall in terms of green, yellow, or red. And one of the things that you would start to think through is, well, what are the potential risks here? So If it's a live stream, perhaps there are people who are in the crowd who haven't guarded their face and maybe their public identity needs to be shielded for some reason. Maybe there's someone who doesn't necessarily have documentation and you don't want to show them at the protest. Maybe it's the case that the protest is being screen recorded elsewhere. And so you're putting people potentially at risk who haven't consented to it. But it might be something that your organization feels is important in order to get more people to show up. So these are the sort of trade-offs that we want to think through. Another example, there's a new volunteer to your organization, and they keep asking to kind of take on digital tasks. They saying, I'm really good with technology. I would love to help manage the email list, or maybe I'd love to help organize our Google Drive or organize our folders. Default green, yellow, or red. And then you can also throw an extra twist in there to think about it. So let's say this person is a great volunteer. We say we feel green about that. This person is someone who we trust. But then over time, this person starts to show up less and less in person. More and more members of the group don't necessarily know who this person is, who has access to a lot of the group's data. This might be something that would move you closer into the yellow zone or the red zone. One other example is, let's say, a documentary filmmaker or local news media, they want to feature your group in an upcoming project that's about community organizing and activism. And so your group is really excited about this. We say this is our green zone. And then the producers, they tell you that, okay, in order to have everyone in this project, we're going to need everyone's name. We're going to need their home addresses as well. And so that might be something that moves some members of your group into the yellow zone. And then let's say there's another wrench thrown in there where the filmmaker asks to have access to your group meetings because they'd like to film footage of what it really feels like on the ground to do this activism. That's going to be something that are going to send some people into the red. That's going to be something that keeps some people in their green. They're like, heck yeah, come on and join our meetings. So these are just some of the things you want to think about and start thinking about what risks are involved in the different situations. So I'm going to pass it over to Penn now to talk about some of the other scenarios that we want to have in mind.
Thanks so much, Trey. I'm so excited to be here with you all. We're going to spend a few minutes now talking about online events. If you want to go to the next slide. So when we're thinking about online events, whether you're attending them or whether you're hosting them, there's some things to think about, like the scenarios that Trey was just throwing out. So one of the things to think about is, are there people RSVPing to this event that you might not know? They might be new. And if that's the case, you have the opportunity by setting up RSVPs to vet them first. So, you can go online and you can Google these people that you might not know. You might find some information about them that tells you this person is most likely genuinely trying to come to this event, or there might be some people, like Trey said, that could move you to the yellow or the red zone. And you think, you know what, maybe I'm not going to tell this person where this event is happening, or I'm not going to give them the Zoom link to get on this event. So there are different ways on the back end that you can kind of think through this before the event happens to set up a secure area, secure online space for you all to connect and talk to each other. And this also moves into talking about, sorry, my computer, I'm sorry. Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, I'm seeing a nod from Julie. Thank you. Okay, I'm back. We're talking about online events and vetting people before they get there. And the other thing that you can think about is the RSVP info that you're collecting. How much data do you actually need from somebody for them to go to this specific event? You probably need their email address to talk to them, and you probably need their name. Do you need to know their address? Do you need to know other things like that? And you can also think about, like Trey was saying, people are going to have access to this data. So are there meetings where, somebody might not want you to have their address in order for them to go to a Zoom meeting because somebody somewhere could eventually have that address, right? So you can kind of think about that along with this too. There are also ways with like Facebook events, you can set up a way for you to approve posts in those events before they actually go up on the page to kind of have a little bit more control over how people are talking and what they're saying about these events. And you can also, like this meeting, enable a waiting room if you're using Zoom. And not all online things are going to be in Zoom behind a waiting room. Sometimes you're going to be live streaming, maybe at an in-person event, maybe to talk about a specific topic. And it's always good to have somebody monitoring the chat who is not one of the speakers on the live stream so that you can kind of see, are there questions coming in that we should be answering? But also are people saying inappropriate things or things that we don't really want in the live stream chat? And then you can go in there, you can hide those comments, you can delete them, and do whatever you need to do to make that a more secure online space. We can go to the next slide, Trey. And bringing this more to an individual personal level instead of thinking about organizing collectively online. We're going to talk about digital threats that can happen to you and doxing specifically. And the big thing with this is to proactively think about what could happen in these scenarios. And if you're thinking about what could happen, you're going to be prepared if something actually does happen. So for doxing specifically, that is when somebody takes your personal information and puts it out publicly online for anybody to have. And it can be sensitive information. It can be your passwords to different online accounts that you have. People have shared people's addresses, and that's put them in danger. There's a lot of different things that can happen when you get doxxed. So if you're thinking, right, I don't want to get doxxed, none of us want to get doxxed, there are some online things preventatively that you can do to decrease the chances of you getting doxxed. And this is talking about your digital footprint. We'll talk more about that in a little bit too. But the key point for this is if you have sensitive information, if your Facebook page is public, you have information on there about where you live, you might want to consider taking down those posts. You might want to consider changing your account to private versus public, or change how people can see individual posts that you have done. So maybe people can publicly see some things, but not the others. And that will create an extra level of security for you when you're trying, excuse me, to set up your digital security. And now the flip side of this, not really the flip side, in addition to this, people can dox you and people can also be trolls online to you. This is usually people who are in opposition to whatever you're organizing around. And it's basically them in your comments spamming you over and over with negative comments. And this can get in the way of organizing. This can scare people away from wanting to get involved. And there are a few ways that you can deal with this. If you have people who are commenting on your stuff doing this, you can block them. You can report them, which is sometimes necessary. You can report profiles to Facebook. I've had instances where people have made a duplicate page of an account that I run and trying to make it look like the real one. So in those instances, you can report fake pages to Facebook and other social medias. And also, sometimes depending on the situation, you can also ignore them if it's not too bad, and sometimes they'll stop on their own. It really depends on the situation with trolling. And this is kind of gets back to what I was saying before. You can look at the very specific security settings on your personal social media accounts, and you can decide individually what things you want private and what things you want public. We can go on to the media section. So personally, individually, on top of securing everything that you have online, if you're out at a protest, if you're at an in-person event, there might be a world where reporters are there, the media is there. And that's important to think about because if you're talking to the media, if you're interviewing on the news, anything that you have online that is public to get, people can put in articles, people can put on the news, they can put any of your information out there that you have publicly online. So if you have stuff, that you've posted before that you don't want in this article about the school board meeting that you're attending, right? You might want to consider before you're making those statements in public that your digital stuff is looking how you want it. And this gets back to the point of curating your digital footprint. And with that comes protecting your public persona. So, you could spend an afternoon if you wanted scrolling through 10 years of your Facebook posts. And, if you want to go individually and see what things you want to hide, you could say, that's too much for me. I'm just going to make my whole account private. And then maybe you go through your friends list because you might have some people on there that could be oppositional. You just make sure that you trust everybody that you have on there. And that will set you up for success when you're out in public and are passionate about a topic and want to say a quote to a reporter or something like that. And we can go to the next one. And this is just building on that a little bit. If you are out and about, it's also important to use these tools in the opposite way. So if you're out in the world and there's reporters there, you can say no, that you don't want to give people a quote. You don't have to give people your name. You can approach that however you want. And in addition to that, if you know the reporter in advance, you know that you're going to be going to this interview on Thursday at 7 p.m., you can Google that reporter. You can look at their social media accounts and you can see how they've written about the topic that you're going to be talking about. And you can kind of see the angle that they're going to take. And that's important because when you go to talk to these people, right, you can know in advance what your main message is and you always bring it back to your main message. And this is important for digital security because this means they can't take words out of your mouth that you didn't say. If you have one message that is your main point and you stick to it, then that's the only thing that they will have from you that they are able to use and that they're able to put in their articles. And then these articles get published online with your name in them, and then they're on the internet forever. So thinking about what you say and what you don't say can also affect your online presence. Let me make sure there are no more points on this one. I want to say one more thing on this. If you are trying to stick to your point, and if a reporter or somebody interviewing you is trying to ask you questions that feel off the wall or out of left field, you don't have to answer those questions. You can say, interesting question. I'm actually here to talk about X, Y, and Z. You don't have to answer their questions. You only have to say what you want them to hear. And that's going to help you a lot when it comes to things getting put out to big audiences, different news outlets, and all of those things. And I'll also say that if you're doing this for a while and you're talking to your local news outlets, you're going to know the reporters personally over a period of time, and this will become easier. So you're going to know, I'm going to call this reporter because they always report on this in a positive way, right? So you're going to be able to identify over time which opportunities you want to take. Okay, we can move on to the next section.
Awesome. Thanks, Penn. And I would just sort of say to kind of recap these sections we went through, we were trying to give a sense of what are the different areas where you could be exposed. So we started with surveillance, and that could be coming from the government. It could be coming from a law enforcement agency. It could be coming from a company. There's also risk that could come from individuals, whether that's bad actors or people who just don't support your work. And then you can also face risk depending on your social media presence or your activity in the media. And all of these things are things that are going to elevate your profile or have more people sort of applying scrutiny to you. And so what we want to do is sort of talk about a few practices just to make sure that when that does happen, which is something we know will happen if we are activists and out in public, when that does happen, how can we make sure that the things we want to protect remain safe and in our control, and we guarantee that we don't bring harm to ourselves or to anyone else that we care about in this work. So we're going to go through a few of these practices and just spend a bit on them. And if you don't remember anything else we said, these are kind of the main points that we want to emphasize during this training. So, encrypted communications. So I made this kind of slide to try to talk about what encryption is. So basically what encryption does, it's a way of converting information into a secret code so that only the person on the other end of it with the right sort of key can unlock the information. So let's say we're communicating on a secure platform. What would happen is in this first example, I'm the Garfield, and I send a message to you. If we're communicating on an encrypted platform like Signal, what's going to happen is it's going to go to an encryptor, then it's going to get scrambled into a code, and while it's sort of in the space, being communicated to you, it's in code form. So that if someone is trying to hack and access the message that you're sending, when they see it, they're only going to see this message in the middle, which is gobbledygook and it doesn't make any sense. And then what happens on the other end when Dolly gets it is that the message becomes unscrambled because her device has the key through the messaging platform. So the important thing about this is that messaging apps we want to use things that are end-to-end encrypted, meaning they're encrypted for Garfield and they're also encrypted for Dolly. This is really important. And just to talk a little bit about the different options, Signal is the one that I recommend most and that a lot of people in the digital security space recommend the most. There are a couple of other apps that also have encryption. So WhatsApp has encryption and iMessage has encryption if you are messaging another person who has an iPhone and is using iMessage. The only caution I would offer with those two services is that they do also, they report up to Meta and to Apple, which in certain cases have been asked by law enforcement to turn over data. And so, just as that plays out over the future in terms of legal battles, what information they're able to keep or turn away, we just want to be mindful that the companies could have access to some of this information. Apple and Meta collect what's called metadata about the messages, so they aren't actually reading your messages, but they do store information such as what time the messages were sent, what location you were in when the message was sent, sometimes about who the recipient was. And so even that information could be something you might not want to get out there. And so that's why whenever we're talking about this, I usually recommend Signal. Um, Same example on the bottom. I'm just very proud of this reference because Dolly is working at 925 Street, which is my joke that I have built into this. And if you don't get it, you don't get it. If you get it, I hope you love it. Okay, so going back to this, so encrypted communications, signal for sensitive communication between your members, especially if you're talking about something that you don't want to get out ahead of time. So whether that's you're planning for a rally, maybe you're at a board meeting, you're at a legislative hearing, and you're wanting to sort of send quick messages between your members that you don't want to be shared or you don't want anyone else to have access to. Signal is going to be a great place for that. The other encryption that I would encourage people to have in mind is what's called a virtual private network or a VPN when you're using the internet. So what happens with a VPN is essentially it's another encryption service, but for your internet activity. So let's say we're at a local coffee shop and we're having a group meeting. I'm working in our files to I don't know, I'm collecting member information about who came to the last event. I'm analyzing that information, and I have access to people's addresses. Maybe I'm on the internet and I have access to my group's shared credit card or bank account. Or maybe I just have other information that is sensitive and I don't want to get out. If you're on a public Wi-Fi network, any bad actor, someone could hack and get access to and track what you're doing on your computer when you're on a shared network. And so what a VPN does, it's a service that allows you to kind of scramble it in the same way that we do with other encrypted communications. So what the VPN does is say I'm on the internet, I'm surfing. It sends a signal to another remote location, and my internet activity is actually happening from another location. So let's say I send an email, it's actually being sent from a location, maybe in Taiwan, maybe it's in Chicago. Maybe it's somewhere in Mexico City. The source and it goes back encrypted to the secure site and then back to your computer. So basically, what it's doing is creating an extra layer where things are scrambled so that someone can't intercept your messages. They also can't intercept your location, which is something that might be important depending on how sensitive the information is that you're handling. So just to go back to this, this is kind of how encryption works. It's again, just think about it as a scrambling service, and this is something that you're going to want to use anytime you're handling sensitive communication. Think about it as like if you have a door and you're walking through it, you might have a lock on the door, and that's important. But what encryption does is it's kind of like a scary dog behind the door, which is like another layer to make sure that the person isn't able to get in and to access your intimate or sensitive space. And I'll pass over to Penn now.
Next on the list is two-factor authentication. Most websites and places where you can create accounts for something online offer this automatically nowadays, but a lot of them still don't make you enable it. The way that two-factor authentication works is when you go to log into somewhere, you have to provide your password, and then you also have to provide a code that they either text to your phone or that you get through an authentication app, depending on the website or app that you're trying to access. So whenever that's available, you should always enable that. And then the second thing, I already saw some folks putting suggestions for this one in the chat, but password management is also really important. So I saw some people talking about LastPass or other options. These are websites and apps that you can use to store your passwords in a secure way. It puts them in a place where only you can get them with the information that you have. And that's another layer of security, another, like Trey is saying, there's the door, there's the dog. This is another layer before people can access your information. And the same thing with this, a lot of these websites that help you manage your passwords also will create passwords for you. It's really important that, you aren't using the same password for all of your accounts. You can use something called a password generator, and it will give you a random string of letters and numbers to use as your password. And that's why a password management system, because it becomes important, because if they're all big, long strings of numbers and letters, they're really hard to remember. So having a place to reference them easily will be important. Trey, I can give it back to you for data safety.
Yes, so just a note on data safety. This is primarily for folks who are working in groups. But one thing we want to be mindful of is the data both that we're collecting about our members and people who participate in our actions, and then where we're storing that data. So one thing that groups do that I think is a best practice is making sure that anytime there's sensitive information online, as soon as it's no longer needs to be stored, taking it off of shared spaces. So if you have a shared drive, if you have a cloud box, OneDrive that your group is working off of, taking things off whenever it's necessary. The other thing that we want to make sure folks are doing is when you're able to put things on a physical hard drive and back them up there. And so that way, when you're traveling or if you're crossing borders, or if there is any sort of data breach, you still have that information backed up in a place that you and other members of your group can access it. And that's a little bit less applicable to individuals. But if you are someone who is a part of a local organizing group, that's something you just want to be mindful about is what data you're collecting, if you actually need it, and if you do need it, how can you keep it safe? Cool. So I think that's it. And now we're going to have time for questions, which is great. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll open up the floor for questions, which Julie is going to facilitate for us. And one thing I would love is if people are able to share in the chat, maybe a practice that you've implemented in your activism and organizing that you love and that you feel like it keeps you safe online, a digital security practice, a tip, something for the group. We covered a few common scenarios here, but there's obviously lots more detail that we could go into all of these topics. And so we're going to send out some more resources after this. And some of these resources in particular help you come up with your own personal risk assessment, how much you're at risk, and then think through what practices you really need to put in place in order to be safe. So I'll pass it over to you, Julie.
The first question somebody asked was, should we use a fake name online?
I would say that some people do, and some people find it helpful. On a lot of online social media platforms, you can create anonymous accounts. You don't have to put your name on there, you don't have to put your information on there, and that can be a way, if you have your personal social media pages that have all your information on it, and then maybe you use your anonymous one to kind of look more into the activism stuff, there can be a benefit to that. Trey, do you have anything on that one?
Um, no, I think you hit it. I would just say if you're someone who is worried, especially at like depending on your involvement with the legal system, so whether that's about your immigration status, whether it's about, a potential history with the criminal legal system, I think those are some of the most sensitive situations in terms of having your mind. But otherwise, I think folks should feel safe to use your name.
So someone asked a really good question, I thought. They were worried about their family members being affected by their activism. And how do you mitigate protecting your family who, are probably not involved in what you are actually doing?
Yeah, this is one where I would say looking at your digital footprint is really important. And I'll flag a couple of other things that we didn't get into, but I think folks should think about when you post photos online, it's you want to think about who's in the photos, who's identifiable. But another thing just to keep in mind is what information in the photograph could help someone identify your location, or other information about you. So maybe you take a photo in front of your house but the house number is in the background of the photo. Or maybe you take a photo and it's at a really recognizable photo shop and you have 10 members of your family there, coffee shop and 10 members of your family are there. And so as you're going through and kind of combing your digital footprint, be mindful of where other loved ones and family members are at risk and are additionally exposed. And then I would just suggest having a conversation with these people, especially people who you feel like are particularly at risk. If someone in your family, if something were to happen, if the consequences were to be more severe or more harmful or something you'd be more worried about, I think talking to those people in particular and kind of getting a sense of how comfortable they are with the work that you're doing. And that's something you're going to have to negotiate at a personal level. This again goes back to the concept of risk appetite. There are some families where they say, heck yeah, go out there and do it. We're so proud of you and what you're doing. And there are some people who say, I don't want to be involved in anything that you're doing. Don't mention me. Don't put my name out there. Don't even say that you have a partner or a daughter or a brother or sister. So these are things that you'll need to negotiate at an individual level. But I think even being mindful of that is really important because it's not always obvious to people the ways that others could become a collateral risk.
So there are a lot of questions in the chat about what are good password control. How do you pick a VPN? Um, is WhatsApp still safe to use, or was it ever safe to use? I don't know. Um, so how do you kind of like vet the different things that you're using to make sure that they're not something that is, going to leak, or they were designed to leak? How do you pick? I know things are in the app store. Does that automatically make them safe, or, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a big piece of this, and this kind of gets at what Trey was saying about Signal versus WhatsApp versus other options. So WhatsApp is owned by Meta, and if you can go online and Google these different services while you're trying to pick them out, you'll see, right, this is owned by Meta, so maybe that's not the best way to go. And you can do the same with VPN options too. You can kind of go online and see who owns them, but also who is using which ones. There's a lot of people on this call who are all interested in doing the same type of work, organizing. So talk to each other and see which ones that other people are using and having success with. You might meet somebody who is like, I hate this VPN thing that I tried. I like this one way better. And that's
Mhm.
also great information as you're picking something out.
Um,
I would only add one small thing to that, which I saw someone put in the chat, which is don't on VPNs, usually the free ones aren't very good. So you're oftentimes going to have to pay for a VPN service, but it's worth it. And in the information we're going to send out afterwards, there's a guide that has some higher quality recommended apps, like we're talking about password management and VPNs.
so in looking at cleaning up what you might have on your Facebook, are public comments retractable?
You can go through and delete any comment that you have ever made on Facebook. You can go back into the settings on the back end. You can see everything that you've ever posted. You have to go through individually if you want to delete those. It takes a long time, but it is possible to do.
Well, if you switch from being public to private, does that automatically make those private too, or are they still public?
Yep, you can, there are specific privacy settings for comments too. So you can make it so only your friends are able to see what you posted, or everybody can see what you posted, and you can set them up individually like that. I will say though, if you have posted it and it has been public before, if somebody screenshotted it or anything like that, it will still exist forever.
Yeah. Um, so what are the top three pieces of advice that you would give individual activists attending a protest? For example, is don't live stream something that you would recommend?
Yeah, there's a specific training we would do around protest itself and around kind of physical safety in that environment. But I would say one thing is making sure that you have access to your resources in case anything escalates. So one of the things I always recommend is making sure you have at least one phone number memorized of an emergency contact. Who do you want to call in case something goes wrong? Sometimes what people will do is kind of write in marker somewhere on their arm or on their leg or something, a phone number just in case something happens to them. And let's say a medical provider or law enforcement or a social worker or someone who's coming to help can reach someone else in your network. I would say be mindful of what you wear and how you present in those settings. If you want to be someone who stands out, or if you want to be someone who blends into the crowd. So let's say you're going to an event, a rally, a protest, and you are a speaker, or you're someone who doesn't mind, you have a fine risk appetite for it. You might wear a flamboyant outfit, but if you're someone who's trying to lay low at one of those events, you're not necessarily that comfortable being there. I would suggest wearing something like muted colors, something that's not that identifiable so that you're able to kind of blend in and not bring too much attention to yourself. And then I guess I would just make sure that you have some kind of a small bag that has kind of basics like water, first aid kit, those sorts of things, just in case anything goes wrong, and just being prepared in case, protests are oftentimes safe, but they're an environment with crowds. You just never know how they're going to escalate, what could happen. There's just so many different variables that you want to be prepared for the worst case scenario in those situations. And I believe one of the guides we send out has some information about this specifically, but there's lots of details about what we can go into in terms of safety at protest and being safe in physical spaces.
And
Well,
one
someone asked, should you take your phone? And if you do take your phone, should it be in airplane mode?
Yeah, I was about to talk about phones actually. So, that is a great question because you should consider these things when you're going to protests. Some people don't bring their phones at all because your phone can effectively act as a location GPS device, right? It'll show that you were at this location. So that is a risk that you have to weigh with bringing your phone. And then if you do bring your phone, you have to think about those risks too. If you do have an interaction with law enforcement and they try to take your phone, right? You want to make sure that people's text messages aren't showing up on your home screen. You want to make sure those notifications are up because then they can't get into your phone to see those things without your permission. You also want to disable Face ID if you have that on because they could do the Face ID to get into your phone otherwise. And also, all of these apps that you have on your phone most likely have access to your location too. So you should go into your phone settings and see which apps you are sharing your location with and when. There are different settings. You can share your location with an app at all times. You can share your location only when the app is open, or you can make it so they can't have your location at all. So I think those are all important things to consider too.
Yeah, and just one more thing I'd add on that is if you're going with a group, make sure you all talk about a plan about where you're going to meet up or where you're going to go in case you get separated from each other or in case something goes wrong. Sometimes there are situations where if a protest does escalate, the law enforcement will shut down all of the cell phone signal or service in an area. And so then it'll be hard to get in contact with someone through your phone. And so just make sure that you've thought through some of these contingencies ahead of time and talked with your group about how you want to find each other.
Somebody's traveling to France and to Albania next week. So they want to know if the Facebook and LinkedIn entries will be at risk in those two countries specifically, but in other countries as well.
I think there's a lot of factors that would determine that. Like, are your posts public? And then are you, I'm not sure if the person is asking if it's entering the border of the other countries or if it's coming back into the United States. We aren't seeing that much activity in terms of people being stopped at other countries. But if you are returning to the US from internationally, usually US citizens are able to get through customs quite easily, but there have been situations where that's not true. But if you are someone who has a different legal status, whether it's a green card, a temporary visa, something else, I would be especially mindful of that. And I've been seeing people put some stuff in the chat that is great advice in terms of making sure you turn off your biometrics so that they can't get into it, and making sure that there is nothing on there that you would be worried about. So one thing that some people do, again, depending on your risk level, some people will just delete messaging apps off of their phone when they're crossing the border and then just re-download it once they're through the checkpoint and in the other location. So that's an option for you if you feel especially concerned about getting through those borders.
Somebody said they created a password protected document where they keep their passwords. Do you think that's secure enough?
I think that it's more secure than not having them in a password locked document. I think that is one of those happy mediums with, like Trey is talking about, with risk factors, right? If that level of security for the passwords that are stored in there and what those can access makes sense to you, then yes. But Trey, I'll let you say if you think otherwise.
Yeah, I think there's what you're doing there is you're putting up an additional barrier or step for someone who's trying to get your information. And so as many steps as you can put, as much of a headache or a hassle as you can make it for anyone who's trying to get your information. I think that's great. The safest thing is going to be a password manager. It's safer than it's safer than the document. And one thing that's nice about the password managers is they update over time. So certain websites or apps will make you update your password every year or every few months. The password manager will automatically update that when you're signing in. And so I think that can be nice so you don't have to manually go in and update your document.
Somebody brought up all of these things we have in our houses that could be spying on us, like our smart TVs, our computer cameras, any in-house cameras that we may have, like for a security system. How do you protect yourself with those? Is there a way to, make sure that it's only going where it's supposed to go?
Yeah, with most of those, there is a setting where you can turn off the constant listening or constant recording. That makes the device less convenient because then you can't just talk to it and it'll recognize your voice and do what you want it to do. But I do think it's safer. And then I would just do research depending on what company the device is from, how likely it is to that information could be used elsewhere. There are companies that have more of a reputation for selling that data to advertisers. For example, there are companies like Ring, for example, that I had in an earlier slide. Ring quite frequently turns over camera footage, usually to local law enforcement, but there have been other cases where they've turned it over. And so I would just be mindful about the different platforms and think about who they might be sharing the information with. And to be honest, most of these things that are listening to you in terms of the home devices, they're listening to you to give money to advertisers so that they can sell you, a new t-shirt or a new bath soap. And sometimes that's kind of nice. I'm like, oh wow, I really did want that. I really did want that thing this weekend. So I think there's an upside too, which is it makes life more convenient, but it definitely makes you a little bit more unsafe.
So when you're posting a photo on Facebook or Instagram or wherever you're posting a photo, could someone download that photo and find out where it was taken? Like, is there something encrypted in the photo itself?
I'm not sure. I don't think if you download it that you get the location info. Is that correct, Trey? Yeah.
Yeah, it would have to be the platform has access to that metadata based on when you upload it. But I don't believe the other person when they download it because they aren't getting an original
Mm,
file, and so it shouldn't download the metadata with that.
yep.
Um, so based off your discussion about what data you collect, what are you collecting and keeping, i.e. chat, registration information, etc.?
Yeah, I think if you're collecting information for events, it makes sense to keep that information to reach out to people in the future. A lot of organizations have platforms that kind of store this data for them, but you can also do it yourself, and you can use a lot of these tools that we're talking about to make sure that information is in a secure location that nobody else can get access to.
iPhone has a password app. Is it secure?
I would say so. I've not used it, but yes, I believe that one is good.
Yeah, Apple has pretty good encryption and safety mechanisms, and one of the things we mentioned earlier is like the iMessage, for example, is end-to-end encrypted. Apple, the company, has access to some of that data, so if you're worried about that, just be mindful of it. But most of their services are solid.
Mhm.
Burner phones, can they be tracked with credit cards?
I think that they could track where you purchased it and when you purchased it if you do it with a credit card. Typically, people will buy those with cash.
Okay. I want to thank you because this has been really, really informative and very, very helpful. And I'll pass it to Julie.
Yeah, just want to say thank you too, both to Penn and Trey for all this amazing information. I'm glad we had so much time for Q&A because it seems like there were a lot of questions.
Mhm.
So, thank you again to both of you for the wonderful info, and everybody have a really great evening. Bye,
Take
all.
care.